Chapter 11. David Livingston, whose name has become so distinguished on account of discoveries in southern and central Africa, is native to Scotland. In the introductory chapter to his interesting missionary travels and research in South Africa, Dr. Livingston makes passing mention of a few of his ancestors, showing that he came of good honest stock. Our great-grandfather, he says, fell at the Battle of Culloden fighting for the old line of kings, and our grandfather was a small farmer in Ulva where my father was born. It is one of the closer of the Hebrides, thus it was one of the cluster of the Hebrides, thus alluded to by Walter Scott. And Ulva dark and Colonsay and all the group of islands gay that guard famed stuff around. Our grandfather was intimately acquainted with all the traditionary legends which that great writer has since made use of in the Tales of a Grandfather and other works. As a boy, I remember listening to him with delight, for his memory was stored with a never-ending stock of stories, many of which were wonderfully like those I have since heard while sitting by the African evening fires. Finding the resources of his farm unable to support a large family, the grandfather transferred the scene of his storytelling and industry to Blanchery Works, a large cotton manufacturer on the Clyde not far from the city of Glasgow. In these extensive works, he and his sons were honorably employed by the proprietors. It would be difficult to speak of Dr. Livingston's father and mother and of his early life in more appropriate words than he has himself used. He says, "Our uncles all entered His Majesty's service during the last French war, either as soldiers or sailors. But my father remained at home, and though too conscientious ever to become rich as a small tea dealer, by his kindness of manner and winning ways, he made the heartstrings of his children twine around him as firmly as he had possessed, as if he had possessed, and could have bestowed upon them every worldly advantage. He reared his children in connection with the Kirk of Scotland, a religious establishment which had been an incalculable blessing to that country, but afterward left it, and during the last 20 years of his life led the office of deacon of an independent church in Hamilton, and deserved my lasting gratitude and homage for presenting me from my infancy with a continuously consistent pious example, such as that the ideal of which is so beautifully and truthfully portrayed in Burns's Cotter's Saturday Night. He died February 1856, in peaceful hope of that mercy which we all expect through the death of Lord our Savior. I was at that time on my way below the Zumbo, expecting no greater pleasure in this country than sitting by our cottage fire and telling him my travels. I revere his memory. I revere his memory. The earliest recollection of my mother recalls a picture so often seen among the Scottish poor, that of anxious housewives striving to make both ends meet. At the age of 10, I was put into the factory as a piercer to aid by my earnings in lessening her anxiety. With a part of my first week's wages, I purchased rudiments of Latin, and pursued the study of that language for many years afterwards with unabated ardor. At an evening school, which met between the hours of 8 and 10, the dictionary part of my labors was followed up till 12 o'clock or later. If my mom did not interfere by jumping up and scratching and snatching the books out of my hands, I had to be back at the factory by 6 in the morning and continue my work, with intervals for breakfast and dinner till 8 o'clock at night. I read that in this way many of the classical authors and knew Virgil and Horace better than at 16 than I do now. Our schoolmasters, happily still alive, was supported in part by the company. He was attentive and kind, and so moderate in his charges that all who wished for education might have obtained it. Many availed themselves of the privilege, and some of my schoolfellows now rank in positions far above what they appeared ever likely to come to when in the village school. If such a system were established in England, it would prove a never ending blessing to the poor. In this happily described scene of his boyhood, David Livingston had been born 1815. He began his occupation of a piercer in the cotton works at the age of 10. It will be seen from the foregoing questions that what with piercing, reading, studying, and the ambitious lad did not leave many hours to sleep. He says he read everything that he could lay his hands on except novels, scientific works, and books of travels being, however, his special delight. It appears that his father was of opinion that works of science were inimical to religion, and insisted upon David's reading those works which were supposed to be the most conducive to his religious education. Upon this point, the son at length rose in open rebellion and tells us that the last application of the rod to him, from which we may infer that the parental government did not always take the form of moral suasion, was upon his refusal, point blank, to read Wilberforce's Practical Christianity. This dislike to what Dr. Livingston calls dry doctrinal reading continued for several years when he discovered a number of religious works which were in themselves interesting, and agreed with him in the idea that religion and science were not hostile to each other. Such being David Livingston's course of intellectual culture during boyhood and youth, his manual labor continued for many years without cessation, and it is believed without complaint. It cannot be doubted that the boy and youth he was a good hand in the factory. So we find him promoted from situation of a piercer to that of a spinner, the latter being a position at once laborious though requiring more skill, better paid. His moral education, meantime, proceeded apace. That this it will be best to relate in his own language.